Hi, my name is Paul Sargent. Welcome again to AP European History. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the 1920s in Europe. Now, this is a time where we're going to see really three things happening. Number one, we're going to see France trying to secure its borders against Germany, frantically creating all kinds of different situations to make sure that they don't get invaded again. You can understand why. Last time they were invaded, and even the time before that, didn't work out so well. I mean, in the end, France won World War I, but all of the fighting was done on their soil. The second thing we're going to find is the absolute failure of the German Weimar Republic. And largely, especially initially, it has to do with economics. So we're going to look at economic problems that happen in Germany and how we go about fixing those. And the United States comes in and helps out a little bit. And then finally, we're going to look at the stock market crash of 1929 and how the onset of the Great Depression changes all of the things that people had tried to put together in the 1920s, which will lead us into the 1930s, and that's got some not so good things. So anyway, here we go, the 1920s in Europe. Enjoy.
So in order to understand the 1920s, you have to understand the fact that the Versailles Peace Treaty was not perfect. All right? It led France to really spend most of the 1920s trying to secure the security that they had tried to secure, if that makes any sense to anybody, in the Treaty of Versailles. And so they're going to spend most of the 1920s making agreements with different people and trying everything they can to stop Germany from ever rising again. Now, don't forget that Germany and its allies had already lost tons of territory in the peace agreements. But there was more. Now, the most important reason to do this, or the easiest, I guess, was to force these reparations on them. And the reparations were set on Germany at a whopping total of 33 billion US dollars, which proves absolutely impossible for the German government to pay. Now, the German government itself is being beset on all sides by communists and monarchists and revolutionaries and everything else. They certainly can't pay this. In retaliation, the French move into the most industrialized area of Germany, the Ruhr Valley, and take it over. This doesn't go over so well with the Germans. So they decide to start just printing money in order to meet the obligations of the Versailles Treaty. And they print so much money and give it to the Allies that the money becomes absolutely worthless. It goes from a mark or a dollar being worth about 4.2 marks in 1914 to a dollar being worth about 4.2 trillion marks in 1923. You can see here that money was so cheap and so worthless that people are using it to stack as blocks, to use for crafts, and even to wallpaper their homes. And when that's your cash, you got problems.
Yeah, so basically hyperinflation is a bad thing. If you go out and you print all the money you need and you just give it away, it's not worth anything. If I were to write down A's on a piece of paper and give one of those to every one of my students and say, hey, you get this whether you study or not, they become worthless. But if I have one and I say one of you is going to get the A and it's the person who's going to study the hardest, then there's competition and that becomes very, very, very valuable, that piece of paper. So the same thing can be said for Germany. When they deal with their problem by simply printing money, they throw themselves into economic collapse. And as you've seen, it got so bad that it ruined the savings of a whole lot of people. That's not a good situation for a new republic.
So in light of this, France in 1924 agrees to a restructuring of the German debt and a program that will realistically allow them to pay the reparations they owe. So it's at this time where this fairly familiar face, Adolf Hitler, decides to stage his first coup. He and some friends in the National Socialist Party, which is one of many parties that pop up, decide to try and take over the government in Munich. And they hold a coup. It's unsuccessful, they're put on trial, and Hitler spends some time in jail. Now, jail turns out not to be such a bad time for him. Here's a picture of them hanging out in jail. But while he's there, he does do one major thing. He writes his book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which will turn out to be the blueprint for a new Germany that's to come just a few years later. So by 1924, Germany's debt problem was pretty much solved. at least for now, and many of the insurrections were put down. And so France turned to the League of Nations for its big hope for international peace. Now, if you recall, this was created by Woodrow Wilson in an attempt to be a place where nations could come together and talk out their problems and prevent war. And it ends up that's what they did. But that's all they could do is talk. They were absolutely ineffectual. And when the United States would refuse to join the League of Nations, one of the most powerful countries on earth was not part of the peacemaking process. So France tries some other tactics. In 1925, the Locarno Treaty is signed, which guarantees all of the borders again from the Versailles Treaty. In 1926, Germany is admitted to the League of Nations. And in 1928, the Kellogg-Briand Pact is signed by lots of nations, ensuring peace throughout the world by outlawing war as a method of international policy. But ultimately, all of these things are doomed to failure. And there's one reason. The reason is that there is a completely ineffective League of Nations. And without that, war is unavoidable.
So the lesson of all this for France is that if you go through and you make all these agreements with people, they're only as solid as long as people live up to the agreements. And the one place, the one thing that could have held all these agreements together was the League of Nations. But the League of Nations is not functioning right. And the strongest powers are not really part of it. And that proves to be a problem. You just wait till someone who comes from Germany, has a name that rhymes with Fittler, decides to try and see just how far he can get with the League of Nations. Turns out, he can get pretty far.
And as if that wasn't bad enough, in 1929, the stock market crashed, causing billions of dollars to disappear. People ran to banks, banks shut down, the global economic system collapsed, and all of the world dropped into a depression, which would be really harmful for people in Europe.
All right, so to sum it up, basically what we've seen is that France was completely unsuccessful in trying to secure itself from German aggression, that Germany was completely unsuccessful in trying to establish a republic which had a strong economy, and part of it was because France was all over them, and the efforts of the United States and Britain and lots of other people to try and help stabilize the situation ultimately failed when the Great Depression hit and basically no one could pay their debts. So the big picture here is, guys, that solutions to problems really need to be thought out. And sometimes creative solutions to problems won't work. And so it takes different solutions and different answers in order for problems to be worked out. So think about that. And I'll see you next time. Hope you're enjoying these videos. My name's Paul Sargent. Tune in again.